think I was 19 the first time I tried acid. It was one tab. It was enough.
I was around about 20 when I first took LSD or acid, and the dose was one tab, a blotter.
The first trip was definitely intense. I haven't experienced anything quite like it before.
The first acid trip was very enjoyable. It was a lot of fun. I had a couple of friends who were also taking acid with me, and we sat around, listened to music, smoked countless joints and cigarettes, and had a blast. We had a great time.
I remember taking the tab and thinking, oh, I'm not feeling anything yet. And then we were sat on this hill with me and all my friends, and the sun was beating down. Then all of a sudden it just sort of it came in a wave. I remember looking down at my arm, and my arm was sort of melting into the hill. And then I was like, oh yeah, I'm definitely tripping.
So LSD has many different kinds of effects on the human brain. But what we do know is that some of these effects can include changes in the way that visual cortex, so the areas of the brain that are responsible for processing visual inputs, they are also among those that are affected by LSD, and that may partly be responsible for hallucinations.
I remember I was still tripping quite into the evening because we'd taken it about in the afternoon. And as we were getting back to the tents, I remember two of my friends were in a sleeping bag and they looked like this two-headed worm. And I was aware I was tripping. Now I remember thinking, oh, those are my friends. Why are they two-headed worm?
We often think of the brain as being comprised of different distinct brain regions, which are physically connected to each other by so-called white matter pathways. Under normal conditions, you might have some regions that tend to activate more at a particular point in time, and at that same point in time, some other regions become somewhat less active than they normally are, and they tend to alternate in this way. And what we see under LSD is that this particular kind of alternation breaks down a bit, so that you might have regions activating together, which normally would tend not to be active at the same time. And normally, you might expect the communication to take the most direct path that exists between them. But something that we see under the effects of LSD is that information takes more circuitous routes and takes detours, even though, of course, it's not easy to pinpoint exactly all and only the changes, since LSD also has a number of other effects on brain function.
I had a trip once. I was sitting in a squat with friends of mine, and we'd all taken quite a powerful tab of acid each, and somewhere along the trip, I don't know how far into it, I was sitting there in one of the empty rooms of this squat on my own, on the floor, bare floorboards, and then I saw my mind projected in front of me as a kind of circuit board of energy. I could see its intricate workings. I could see how the thoughts moved. I could see synapses firing. And it was truly amazing. And then I began to think, you know, if I knew what I was doing, I could be like a gardener or a surgeon and prune or cut or redirect and make this mind, you know, perfect or better. Is it possible for the mind to rewire itself? Yes, it is. It takes an extraordinary amount of work. It is entirely possible to change patterns of behavior that you have that are causing you pain or are preventing you living a full life. LSD or acid is not necessary for that. It can be done without it. But in some therapeutic situations, it can maybe help in in shortening the time that it takes to come to the awareness of any issues that need attention.
Prior to my first ever tab, I was quite an introvert. I wasn't always like the life of the party. I wasn't. And then since doing acid, I'm quite open with myself. I'm quite open sharing myself with even strangers. There was a point in the trip, especially when it first started, when I was wondering, I kept thinking to myself, do people know that I'm tripping? And then I remember looking around at the festival and everyone was in some kind of altered state, and no one was sober. And it just occurred to me that everyone is doing their own sort of thing, and people aren't as aware of you as you are of yourself. That was a big like turning point in my life. And just even having that space to have that monologue in your head, like that one time was enough for me to get over a lot of the fears and anxiety I had previously.
So a pivotal mental state is what Robin Carhart-Harris calls a state where there is particularly high plasticity and a particularly high likelihood for rapid learning or in general change in beliefs or attitudes. And LSD is one of the ways in which this is thought to potentially come into play. But of course, nothing in life or even in science is ever certain. So that change can go both ways. It can be helpful or it can be harmful. And what determines what is going to happen is likely to be the context. So the particular environment, the particular emotional state that the person is in at a particular point.
There is a right amount of drugs to do when it comes to hallucinogenic drugs, and the right amount is to explore your mind. The wrong amount is to destroy your mind.
My last trip was my last trip because it was such a powerful experience.
I wasn't in the right mindset. I wasn't with my group of friends. I was only with one friend.
The trip started off as usual, a great deal of fun. And then it became just stronger and stronger and stronger.
It was fun to begin with, but there was probably about 12 hours in, there was this impending sense of dread where the hallucinations just wouldn't stop.
I got up at one point and walked down the length of the flat, through the kitchen and into the bathroom, where I looked at myself in the mirror. Interesting to do when you're tripping because you see unexpected things. But anyway, I looked at myself in the mirror, and then the mirror became a sort of screen. And then I realized I was looking at my future. And then I thought, no, I don't want to see this. And it stopped instantly. It stopped, and the last image is the only one I remember, thankfully. And that's of me and two other people who I don't know, standing in what looks like an industrial estate with warehouses around. And that was it.
I didn't leave that trip feeling better or feeling like I'd connected myself spiritually to the world. I left that trip thinking, whew, how did I survive that? And that's not how LSD should be treated. You are vulnerable, you are not in the right state of mind, and it can be dangerous.
Yes, you are vulnerable because you are not fully aware of the environment you're in. There's the danger to your physical self because you do something foolish maybe, or you don't see the car coming and you step out into the road. But then there are the psychological dangers which are real, because if you have an experience that you have repressed, that is a trauma, and the reason it's repressed is that it's so painful you don't want to have to consider it, and then taking LSD brings this traumatic experience directly into the forefront of your mind, then that can be dangerous because you might not know how to respond to it. You might not be able to respond to it. It might post-trip bring suicidal thoughts. And this is where, if somebody is seeking LSD for therapy, they would be very wise to have a counsellor, a trained psychologist or psychiatrist with them who can help explain what's going on.
If we were talking about acid as a tool, I would like to see it used to help open people up who are anxious. Without a doubt, I can say there was a noticeable difference between the first time I tried LSD to how I was before.
In the past 2 decades, in the past decade in particular, there has been a resurgence of interest in the potential therapeutic effects of psychedelics like LSD, but also psilocybin, which is the compound found in magic mushrooms. And in particular, there are a number of studies that are ongoing, including clinical trials, about the potential of some of these drugs for helping people who are suffering from various mental health conditions, such as treatment-resistant depression, but also anorexia, PTSD, and other forms of mental illness. I should emphasize that many of these studies are just only very recently published or still underway. So it is important to recognize that a lot more needs to be done before we can draw any conclusive results out of this. But many of them are currently underway because of this increased interest in the potential for these drugs to help potentially some people under the right circumstances. And of course, in all of these cases, the health of the volunteers or the patients themselves is the most important thing. So because of that, there are ethical procedures that need to be, ethical approvals that need to be obtained before these studies can be carried out. And they are carried out in the presence of clinically trained personnel.
If it was regulated, if it's in a regulated, controlled environment, you'd be able to research it more. You'd be able to help people who have problems with it. It's the simple no answer to drugs just doesn't work.
The illegality of drugs cause for a negative view of it. The illegality of drugs cause problems with drugs that are not clean, drugs that if they were legal and had to be monitored by a government service would mean that you knew what the dose was, you knew what was in it. Whereas at the moment, that's all in the hands of a criminal group who don't really care about your health one bit.
There's a lot of negative stigma on all drugs, and just as a point, I like to think of myself as the example in this. I'm a functioning member of society and contributing member of society, and the fact that I've experimented with substances, and I like to experiment with these substances, doesn't detract from who I am as a person.
I think it's part of the stigma comes from just knowing so little, and I think the more we understand, the more we will understand that they are just chemical compounds that have specific effects on the mind, and we can understand what they do to the mind by studying the brain as well. So understanding their role in the natural world in general.
I think it is a valuable tool, although one that should be used extremely carefully.
I feel like the possibilities are endless.
So I'm a PhD student in the Cognition and Consciousness Imaging Group, which is part of the Division of Anesthesia in the University of Cambridge. Part of our research is motivated by the fact that there are many patients who sometimes may have some kind of brain injury, and as a result they may fall unconscious and remain unconscious chronically for a very long time. And we want to understand more about what consciousness is and how the brain supports it. Because if we understand that, then we might also be able to understand what kind of treatment would be helpful to try and restore consciousness in these patients. So what we're looking at is how reversible ways of losing consciousness, like anesthesia, could in some sense tell us what happens to a brain that loses consciousness, with the hope that that can in turn inform the way that we think and we care about these patients who have lost consciousness because of some brain damage. And of course, one aspect that we don't get when we study anesthesia or these patients is what it is like to be in that particular condition. Because of course, if you are anesthetized, then your experiences disappear. As a result of that, it's a bit like being in dreamless sleep. So the interesting thing about psychedelics like LSD is that they also perturb consciousness, like anesthesia does, but they don't remove consciousness, which means that the person is still conscious while they are under the effects of LSD, and therefore they can tell us about their experiences and what they are experiencing. And of course, the other helpful aspect about studying LSD and other psychedelics is that we have reasonably good understanding of their molecular mechanisms of action, which means that thanks to these drugs, we can combine the neuroimaging, so looking at the brain effects, but also the neurochemistry, so understanding the chemical effects. And we can also understand what they do to your subjective mental states. And this is a very unique combination that can help us understand a lot more than we currently know about consciousness and what it is like to be in an altered state of consciousness.
I feel like there is a level of consciousness that you only get from altering your perception of reality. It's like, because reality is distorted, time feels distorted, and you have that chance to question yourself about certain things. You can really learn a lot about yourself in that state of mind.
I would say that acid has changed me, acid and hallucinogens in general has changed me in that I now am a much more questioning type of mind. It's changed me because it's made me see, I guess, see how easy it is to be swept along with the norm.
I feel like it opens you up. Opens up your mind to different possibilities, ways of thinking, gives you a different perspective on life.
You begin to understand that the world actually isn't what you thought it was.